Welcome to Midnight Chronicles tonight. I'll tell you a true story from America's stranger side. One that's a little forgotten, a little unbelievable, and just quiet enough to help you drift away. Picture this. You're scrolling through real estate listings, maybe dreaming of that perfect house with the white picket fence and two-car garage. Suddenly, you stumble across something that makes you do a double take. Prime lunar real estate, 1 acre on the moon's sea of tranquility. It's only $19.99 plus shipping and handling. You'd probably laugh it off as some internet scam, right? Well, buckle up, because millions of people around the world have actually bought into this cosmic real estate venture. And honestly, if you lived in 1950s America with nothing but radio serials and the occasional TV western for entertainment, you probably would have bought a piece of the moon too. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo might be starting their morning commute while someone in London is winding down after dinner. All of us connected by these strange little stories that history left behind. Now dim the lights and let the past whisper you to sleep. The whole thing started with a science fiction writer named Robert Heinlein, though he had no idea he was about to inspire one of the most audacious business ventures in human history. Back in 1950, Heinlein published a novel called The Man in the Moon. Actually, wait, that's not right. It was The Man Who Sold the Moon. And if you think that title sounds a little too on the nose for this story, well, life has a funny way of imitating art, doesn't it? In Heinlein's tale, a clever entrepreneur figures out how to finance the first trip to the moon by selling lunar real estate to earthbound suckers. Pure fiction, right? The kind of ridiculous scheme that could only work in the pages of a pulp science fiction magazine. But here's where reality gets weird, as it often does when you dig into America's stranger corners. Heinlein's fictional moon salesman wasn't selling empty promises, he was selling dreams. And dreams, as any good capitalist will tell you, are surprisingly profitable. The novel tapped into something deep in the American psyche, this idea that if you can see it, you can own it. If you can name it, you can claim it. It's the same spirit that drove pioneers westward, convinced that destiny was manifest and the frontier was infinite. Only now, instead of looking toward California, people were starting to look up. Fast forward 30 years, and you find yourself in 1980s Nevada, where the desert heat makes everything shimmer like a mirage. This is where our real-life moon salesman emerges, though he's nothing like Heinlein's fictional tycoon. His name is Dennis Hope, and he's not some smooth-talking Wall Street type in a three-piece suit. No, Dennis Hope looks exactly like what you'd expect from a guy who decides to claim ownership of the moon. A little eccentric, a little rumpled, with the kind of enthusiasm that makes you wonder if he's brilliant or completely unhinged. Probably both. Hope wasn't some science fiction fan looking to make Heinlein's story come true. He was just a guy going through a rough patch: divorce, financial troubles, the usual midlife disasters that make men do questionable things. But instead of buying a motorcycle or dating someone half his age, Hope did something infinitely more absurd. He decided to own the moon. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally, legally, with paperwork and everything. Now, you might be thinking, surely there must be laws against this sort of thing. And you'd be absolutely right. There are laws. Unfortunately for everyone involved, those laws have loopholes you could fly a spacecraft through. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, signed by all the major spacefaring nations, clearly states that no country can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies. Countries, governments, nations, all explicitly banned from planting flags and declaring cosmic colonies. But here's the thing that kept space lawyers up at night. The treaty forgot to mention individuals. It's the kind of oversight that makes you wonder what those diplomats were thinking back in 1967. Were they so focused on preventing nuclear-armed superpowers from claiming the moon that they forgot about the possibility of some random guy from Nevada deciding to file a claim? Historians still debate whether this was intentional ambiguity or just sloppy drafting. But either way, Dennis Hope found his golden ticket to the stars. Picture Hope in his modest Nevada office, probably with wood paneling, and that distinctive 1980s beige carpet that seemed to infect every commercial building of the era. He's got legal documents spread across his desk, and he's doing something that would make any reasonable person question his sanity. He's writing a letter to the United Nations, the Soviet Union, and the United States government, formally notifying them of his intention to claim ownership of the moon. Not part of the moon, not a section of the moon, the entire moon, all 14.6 million square miles of it. You have to admire the sheer audacity. This is a man who looked up at the same moon that humans had been gazing at for millennia, the moon that inspired poets and lovers, that guided ancient navigators and marked the passage of time for countless civilizations, and thought, yeah, that's mine now. It's either the boldest business move in history or the most elaborate practical joke ever perpetrated on the human race. Hope gave the various world governments 90 days to respond to his claim. 90 days to tell him he was crazy, to laugh him out of whatever office handles correspondence from delusional citizens, to invoke some law or treaty that would shut down his cosmic land grab before it started. And here's the beautiful, absurd truth: nobody responded. Not the UN, not the Soviets, not the Americans. Radio silence from every major power on Earth. Now, in the real world, when the government doesn't respond to your letters, it usually means they're either too busy to bother or they think you're harmless enough to ignore. But Hope chose to interpret this silence as tacit agreement. If nobody objected, then clearly his claim was valid. It's the legal equivalent of calling shotgun on the entire solar system, and somehow it worked. So there you are, Dennis Hope, sitting in your Nevada office with a stack of unanswered letters and the growing realization that you might actually own the moon. What do you do next? If you're a normal person, you probably call a therapist. If you're Dennis Hope, you call a lawyer and ask about the finer points of extraterrestrial property law. The legal principle Hope was banking on is older than America itself. It's called adverse possession, and it's the reason why someone can technically claim ownership of abandoned property if they occupy it long enough without the real owner objecting. Squatters' rights, basically, but applied to a cosmic scale. The logic is beautifully simple. If you claim something, publicly announce your claim, and nobody challenges you within a reasonable time frame, then congratulations, you own it. It's how countless land disputes have been settled throughout history, from frontier homesteads to urban lots. Hope just happened to be the first person with enough chutzpah to apply this principle to celestial real estate. But here's where it gets legally fascinating, in that headache-inducing way that makes law school professors rub their temples. Hope wasn't just claiming the moon for himself, he was claiming it as the representative of all humanity. His argument went something like this: since no government could claim the moon under the Outer Space Treaty, and since the moon clearly needed some kind of legal framework if humans were ever going to live there, someone had to step up and establish property rights. Why not him? It's the kind of circular logic that either makes perfect sense or no sense at all, depending on how much coffee you've had and whether you believe in manifest destiny applied to space exploration. The genius of Hope's approach wasn't in the legal argument. That was shaky at best. The genius was in the timing. This was 1980, remember, when the space age was hitting a serious midlife crisis. The moon landings were over, the space shuttle was still grounded after the Challenger disaster, and Americans were starting to wonder if we'd ever actually do anything interesting in space again. Hope tapped into a deep well of cosmic nostalgia, offering people a chance to own a piece of humanity's greatest adventure for the price of a pizza. And the paperwork, oh, the paperwork, was beautiful. Hope didn't just hand people a receipt and call it a day. No, he created official-looking lunar deeds, complete with legal language that would make a real estate lawyer weep with either joy or horror. These weren't joke certificates you'd find in a novelty shop. They had property numbers, coordinate systems, legal descriptions that referenced actual lunar features. If you squinted just right and suspended your disbelief, they looked like the real deal. The certificates came with a map showing your exact property location, usually in one of the lunar seas, those dark patches on the moon's surface that, early astronomers mistook for actual oceans. Mare Tranquillitatis, Mare Serenitatis, Mare Imbrium, these ancient Latin names suddenly became prime real estate addresses. Hope was essentially creating the first subdivision on another world, complete with property lines and neighborhood associations that would never need to worry about homeowners' dues. But here's what nobody expected. People actually started buying the stuff. Not just a few curious individuals, but thousands of them. Families buying matching plots so they could be neighbors on the moon. Romantic couples purchasing adjacent lots as the ultimate symbol of eternal love. Parents buying lunar land for their newborn children as the world's most impractical college fund. It was like pet rocks, but with more cosmic significance and better paperwork. The psychology behind it is actually pretty straightforward when you think about it. For $20 you could own a piece of the final frontier. You could point up at the moon and tell your friends, "See that crater over there? That's my backyard." It didn't matter that you'd never actually go there, never build a house there, never even send a postcard from there. What mattered was the story, the dream, the sheer audacious impossibility of it all. Hope understood something that traditional businesses often miss. He wasn't selling land, he was selling wonder. He was selling the same feeling that made kids press their faces against planetarium dome ceilings and adults pause their evening. Walks to stare up at the night sky. For the price of dinner and a movie, you could participate in the space program in your own small, legally questionable way. The business model was elegantly simple. Hope would subdivide the moon into 1-acre plots, price them at $19.99 each, plus shipping and handling because even cosmic real estate needs to cover postage, and sell them through classified ads in newspapers and magazines. No sales team, no expensive marketing campaigns, no fancy showrooms. Just a small ad in the back of Popular Science next to the X-ray glasses and sea monkey farms, offering lunar real estate, own your own piece of the moon. Space lawyers, yes, that's actually a thing, were initially too stunned to respond coherently. The whole concept was so absurd that most legal experts assumed it would collapse under its own ridiculousness within a few months. After all, who would seriously buy land on the moon from some guy in Nevada? The answer, as it turned out, was pretty much everyone. By the mid-1980s, Hope's lunar embassy was processing hundreds of orders per month. He'd moved operations from his small office to a larger space, hired assistants to handle the paperwork, and started getting interview requests from newspapers and television shows. The man who had started this venture, as a way to solve his personal financial problems, was rapidly becoming the unofficial real estate mogul of outer space. And still, nobody in any official capacity was telling him to stop. Legal scholars would debate the finer points of space law in academic journals, but no government agency ever issued a cease and desist order. No court ever ruled his claims invalid. The silence that had started as government indifference was now starting to look like tacit endorsement, at least in the eyes of Hope's growing customer base. By 1988, Dennis Hope had done something that would make any legitimate real estate developer weep with envy. He'd created a business with virtually no overhead, infinite inventory, and customers who were perfectly happy to buy property they'd never actually visit. The Lunar Embassy wasn't just some fly-by-night operation anymore. It had become a surprisingly sophisticated enterprise, complete with customer service representatives, detailed property maps, and a filing system that would make the IRS proud. Picture yourself walking into Hope's expanded Nevada headquarters in the late 1980s. The wood paneling is still there, because this is Nevada, and wood paneling is apparently a constitutional requirement. But now there are multiple desks, filing cabinets stretching to the ceiling, and walls covered with detailed lunar maps marked with thousands of tiny property divisions. It looks like a cross between a real estate office and mission control, which is probably exactly the aesthetic Hope was going for. The operation had grown beyond Hope's wildest expectations, which, considering he'd started by claiming ownership of the moon, is saying something. He'd hired a small staff to handle the increasing volume of orders, and they treated their job with the kind of earnest professionalism you'd find at any respectable business. These weren't people who thought they were running a scam. They genuinely believed they were pioneers in extraterrestrial property development. It's either inspiring or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective. The Lunar Embassy's product line had expanded too. You could still buy your basic 1-acre plot for $19.99, but now there were premium options. Want oceanfront property? Mare Tranquillitatis was prime real estate, being the site of the first moon landing. Prefer mountain views? The Lunar Highlands offered stunning crater vistas. Looking for something with historical significance? Plots near Apollo landing sites commanded premium prices, though Hope was careful never to claim he owned the actual landing sites themselves. That would have been presumptuous. But here's what made the whole thing legitimately impressive from a business standpoint. Hope had created an entire infrastructure around his lunar land sales. Each deed came with a detailed property survey, complete with longitude and latitude coordinates that you could actually verify using lunar maps. The certificates included property numbers that corresponded to a master registry, so you could theoretically look up your neighbor's information if you wanted to plan a lunar block party. Hope had even established what he called the Galactic Government, with himself as the founding president naturally. This wasn't just some made-up title for marketing purposes. He'd created an entire governmental structure for his lunar colony, complete with departments of health, education, and environmental protection. The environmental protection part was particularly forward-thinking, considering the moon's environment consists primarily of vacuum and radiation. But Hope was nothing if not thorough. The customer service aspect was where the Lunar Embassy really shone. When people called with questions about their lunar property, and surprisingly many did, Hope's staff treated each inquiry with the same seriousness they'd give to a traditional real estate transaction. Want to know about mineral rights? Those came with your deed. Curious about building restrictions? The Galactic Government had zoning laws. Wondering about property taxes? Well, those were waived indefinitely, which was probably the most honest part of the entire operation. Hope had also started thinking about practical considerations that showed he was either completely delusional or incredibly far-sighted. He'd established a lunar postal system, complete with zip codes for different regions of the moon. He'd created building permits for future lunar construction, which you could purchase along with your land for an additional fee. He'd even started selling lunar vehicle registration, because obviously you'd need to license your moon buggy when the time came. The really remarkable thing about all this was how normal it had become. Hope's staff didn't snicker when they talked about lunar property development. They discussed it with the same matter-of-fact professionalism you'd hear at any real estate office. They'd debate the relative merits of different lunar locations, discuss future development plans, and handle customer complaints with genuine concern. It was as if they'd all collectively agreed that selling real estate on the moon was a perfectly reasonable way to make a living. And from a pure business perspective, Hope had stumbled onto something brilliant. His costs were minimal, some printing, postage and office space, while his potential market was literally astronomical. Every person on Earth was a potential customer, and his inventory would never run out. He'd found the ultimate renewable resource, human gullibility mixed with cosmic wonder. The operation had become so legitimate-looking that banks started accepting lunar deeds as collateral, though whether this was due to bureaucratic confusion or genuine belief in their value remains unclear. Insurance companies began offering policies to protect lunar property investments. Legal aid societies started getting calls from people wanting to dispute lunar property boundaries. Hope had accidentally created an entire shadow economy based on extraterrestrial real estate. Space historians still puzzle over how Hope managed to maintain such a professional operation while selling something that was essentially impossible to deliver. The secret seemed to be his absolute conviction that what he was doing was not only legal, but necessary. In Hope's mind, he wasn't running a scam. He was establishing the legal foundation for humanity's expansion into space. Someone had to do it. So why not him? The media attention was growing too. Hope started getting calls from newspaper reporters, television producers, and magazine writers who were fascinated by this unlikely entrepreneur who'd turned science fiction into a business plan. He gave interviews with the same calm confidence he'd used to discuss corn futures or municipal bonds, explaining the legal technicalities of space property law as if he were teaching a university course. What made these interviews particularly entertaining was Hope's ability to answer even the most skeptical questions with complete seriousness. When reporters asked how customers would ever actually visit their lunar property, Hope would patiently explain that commercial space travel was inevitable, and early property owners would obviously be first in line for lunar colonization. When they pointed out that his deeds might not hold up in actual courts, Hope would cite the government's failure to challenge his original claim as evidence of implicit acceptance. By the end of the 1980s, the Lunar Embassy had sold tens of thousands of acres of moon real estate to customers around the world. Hope had gone from a guy going through a divorce to the self-proclaimed president of the moon's first government, and somehow nobody in any position of authority had told him to stop. It was American entrepreneurship at its most audacious, capitalism, extended to its most logical extreme, and possibly the most successful impossible business in history. Now, if selling lunar real estate to regular folks was impressive, what Hope accomplished next was nothing short of marketing genius. He figured out that if he could get celebrities to buy lunar property, it would legitimize his entire operation in a way that no amount of legal paperwork ever could. After all, if it's good enough for Hollywood, it must be legitimate, right? This is the same logic that sells us everything from luxury cars to breakfast cereals, so why not apply it to extraterrestrial real estate? The celebrity endorsements started almost by accident. Tom Hanks, back when he was transitioning from comedy to serious dramatic roles, purchased a lunar plot as what he claimed was research for his space-themed movies. Whether he actually believed in the legitimacy of the purchase or just thought it was a fun novelty is still debated by entertainment historians, but the effect was immediate. If Captain Miller from Saving Private Ryan owns a piece of the moon, maybe there's something to this whole lunar real estate thing after all. But Hanks was just the beginning. Hope's customer list started reading like the guest registry at a Hollywood awards show. Tom Cruise bought lunar property, presumably for those moments when jumping on Oprah's couch just wasn't enough to express his enthusiasm. Nicole Kidman purchased a plot, which led to the inevitable tabloid speculation about whether she and Cruise were planning a lunar honeymoon. John Travolta, never one to shy away from unconventional investments, bought multiple acres and reportedly asked about building permits for a lunar airport. The political figures were even more surprising. Presidents, prime ministers, and heads of state started quietly purchasing lunar real estate, apparently viewing it as either a harmless novelty or a surprisingly shrewd investment in humanity's spacefaring future. Hope claims to have sold lunar property to 3 former US presidents, though he's diplomatically vague about which ones. The idea of ex-presidents sitting around comparing their lunar property portfolios is either deeply reassuring or mildly terrifying, depending on your faith in political leadership. Ronald Reagan, the former actor turned president, was reportedly among Hope's customers, which makes perfect sense when you think about it. This was a man who believed in Star Wars missile defense systems and wasn't afraid to dream big about America's future in space. For Reagan, buying a piece of the moon probably seemed like a natural extension of his shining city on a hill vision, just relocated to a different celestial body. Hope's international customer base was equally impressive. He claims to have sold lunar property to members of European royal families, though royal protocol prevents most of them from publicly acknowledging their extraterrestrial real estate investments. The idea of the Queen of England quietly owning a few acres on the moon is delightfully absurd, but also strangely fitting for a monarchy that's been adapting to modern times for centuries. The business logic behind celebrity purchases was fascinating to observe. For most famous people, buying lunar property wasn't about the investment potential or even the novelty value. It was about the story. In a world where celebrities constantly compete for attention and uniqueness, being able to casually mention that you own property on the moon was the ultimate conversation starter. It was like having a Rolex or a Ferrari, but with more cosmic significance and better dinner party value. Hope understood this psychology perfectly and started marketing directly to celebrity assistants and wealth managers. He'd send beautifully packaged lunar deeds to talent agencies, complete with detailed explanations of the legal framework and investment potential. The pitch was simple. For less than the cost of a nice dinner, your client could own a piece of the final frontier and have a story that would impress talk show hosts for years to come. The media coverage of celebrity lunar property ownership created a feedback loop that drove even more sales. Entertainment magazines would run features about stars and their lunar estates, complete with photographs of celebrities holding their lunar deeds and speculation about future moon mansion plans. Late-night talk show hosts would joke about their lunar property investments during monologues, which only served to publicize Hope's business to millions of viewers. But it wasn't just American celebrities who were buying in. Hope's international marketing efforts had attracted customers from around the world, including some truly unexpected names. Japanese business leaders, known for their conservative investment strategies, started purchasing lunar property as potential sites for future manufacturing facilities. European environmentalists bought plots with the stated intention of preserving lunar wilderness areas. Australian mining executives purchased large tracts, presumably thinking ahead to eventual mineral extraction rights. The most surprising celebrity customer might have been the Dalai Lama, who reportedly purchased lunar property and dedicated it to the peaceful exploration of space by all humanity. Whether this was a genuine purchase or just a publicist's creative interpretation of a charitable donation is unclear, but the symbolism was perfect. Even spiritual leaders were investing in humanity's cosmic future, 1 acre at a time. Hope started organizing celebrity events around lunar property ownership, hosting moon landing parties, where famous customers could meet each other and discuss their extraterrestrial real estate investments. These gatherings were equal parts cocktail party and science fiction convention, with guests comparing lunar deeds and speculating about future development possibilities while sipping champagne and wearing moon owner name tags. The legitimacy that celebrity ownership brought to Hope's business cannot be overstated. When skeptics questioned the legal validity of lunar property claims, Hope could point to his impressive customer list and ask why so many successful, intelligent people would invest in something fraudulent. It was circular logic, but it was surprisingly effective circular logic. Space industry professionals found themselves in the awkward position of having to explain why celebrity lunar property ownership was legally meaningless while simultaneously trying not to offend potential clients and investors. NASA officials would diplomatically decline to comment on lunar property sales, while private space companies started including disclaimers in their marketing materials about the uncertain legal status of extraterrestrial real estate claims. The psychological impact on regular customers was profound. If Tom Hanks and Ronald Reagan owned lunar property, then clearly this wasn't just some Nevada guy's get-rich-quick scheme. It was a legitimate investment opportunity with serious backing from serious people. Hope had accidentally discovered that celebrity endorsement could legitimize almost anything, even the impossible sale of property on other worlds. By the early 1990s, Hope's celebrity customer list had become one of his most valuable marketing assets. He'd created a club that was exclusive, not because of high prices or limited availability, but because of the sheer audacity required to believe that buying land on the moon was a reasonable thing to do. And somehow, he'd convinced some of the most famous and powerful people in the world to join that club. While celebrities were happily purchasing their lunar estates, and Dennis Hope was expanding his cosmic empire, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the rarefied world of international space law. Picture conference rooms filled with serious people in serious suits, debating the most absurd legal question of the modern era. Can a guy from Nevada actually own the moon? The answer, it turned out, was both absolutely not, and maybe possibly yes, depending on who you asked and how much coffee they'd consumed. The legal community's response to Hope's lunar land grab was a masterpiece of academic confusion. Space. Lawyers, and yes, they prefer to be called space attorneys at cocktail parties, found themselves in the bizarre position of having to take seriously a business model that sounded like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon. These were people who'd spent years studying the intricate details of satellite regulations and orbital debris protocols, suddenly forced to grapple with the question of whether adverse possession applies to celestial bodies. The central legal issue was maddeningly simple and impossibly complex at the same time. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty clearly stated that nations couldn't claim sovereignty over the moon, but it said nothing about individuals. This wasn't necessarily an oversight. The treaty negotiators probably assumed that preventing governments from claiming space territory would automatically prevent private claims. After all, how would an individual enforce property rights without government backing? They hadn't counted on someone like Hope, who was perfectly willing to enforce his property rights through the power of official-looking paperwork and sheer determination. International law experts started publishing papers with titles like Terrestrial, Property Law in Extraterrestrial Contexts, and the Legal Implications of Private Lunar Claims, which sounds like the kind of academic writing that puts graduate students to sleep, but was actually addressing one of the most fascinating legal puzzles of the century. The scholarly consensus was that Hope's claims were almost certainly invalid, but the almost was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The problem for legal scholars was that invalidating Hope's claims required proving a negative, which is notoriously difficult in legal contexts. How do you prove that someone doesn't own the moon when no court has jurisdiction over lunar property disputes? It's like trying to prove that unicorns don't exist by pointing out that you've never seen one. The absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, especially when the evidence would be located 240,000 miles away. Some legal experts argued that Hope's claims were invalid because property rights require effective occupation and control, neither of which Hope could demonstrate regarding the moon. But Hope's lawyers, and yes, he had lawyers by this point, because apparently there are attorneys willing to represent the self-proclaimed owner of the moon, argued that effective occupation was impossible under current technology, making it an unfair standard. It was a legal catch-22. You can't own the moon because you can't occupy it, but you can't occupy it because the technology doesn't exist yet. The European Space Agency took a more pragmatic approach to the whole situation, essentially acknowledging that while Hope's claims were legally questionable, they weren't technically illegal either. This was diplomatic speak for, we have no idea what to do about this guy, so we're going to pretend he doesn't exist and hope the problem goes away. Unfortunately for the ESA, the problem was growing at a rate of several hundred lunar land sales per month. Meanwhile, the United Nations found itself in the awkward position of having to address questions about lunar property rights without officially acknowledging that anyone was actually claiming to sell lunar property. UN officials would give carefully worded statements about the importance of international cooperation in space exploration, while studiously avoiding any mention of the fact that a Nevada businessman was currently subdividing the moon into residential lots. The legal confusion was compounded by the fact that different countries had different interpretations of how international space law applied to private property claims. Some legal systems would automatically invalidate any claim to extraterrestrial property, while others had no specific laws addressing the issue. This created a patchwork of legal frameworks that made it virtually impossible to definitively settle the question of lunar property ownership. Hope's business was thriving in this legal gray area, like a particularly successful weed growing in the cracks of the sidewalk. He didn't need his claims to be legally valid. He just needed them to be legally uncertain. As long as no court definitively ruled against him, he could continue selling lunar property to customers who were happy to suspend their disbelief for $20 and a nice certificate. The most honest legal opinion came from a Harvard space law professor who admitted that Hope's claims were probably invalid, but we won't know for sure until someone actually tries to enforce property rights on the moon, which probably won't happen in our lifetimes. It was the legal equivalent of saying, ask me again in 50 years when this actually matters. Some countries started drafting legislation to specifically address private space property claims, but these efforts were complicated by the fact that lawmakers had to balance preventing fraudulent land sales with not accidentally stifling legitimate private space development. Nobody wanted to be the government that killed the commercial space industry by banning private property rights in space, but nobody wanted to legitimize obviously questionable lunar land sales either. The insurance industry, ever pragmatic, started, offering policies to cover lunar property investments, though the premiums were set at levels that suggested the underwriters had serious doubts about the claim's validity. You could insure your lunar property against theft, which raised the fascinating question of how someone would actually steal land on the moon. Presumably, it would involve very sophisticated equipment and a really good lawyer. Legal scholars still debate whether the international community's failure to shut down Hope's operation constituted tacit acceptance of his claims or just bureaucratic confusion. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Most governments were too busy dealing with earthbound problems to worry about some guy in Nevada selling impossible real estate, but their inaction inadvertently created the legal space Hope needed to operate. By the mid-1990s, the legal status of lunar property ownership had become what lawyers call constructively ambiguous, which is professional terminology for nobody knows what's going on, but everybody's pretending they do. Hope had managed to build a multi-million-dollar business in the space between what was clearly illegal and what was demonstrably legal, and apparently that space was big enough to park a lunar real estate empire. Once you've successfully convinced thousands of people to buy property on the moon, the logical next step is obvious. Why limit yourself to just one celestial body when there's an entire solar system full of real estate opportunities? By the mid-1990s, Dennis Hope had exhausted the novelty of being merely the moon's landlord and decided to expand his cosmic property portfolio to include pretty much everything in the solar system that wasn't already inhabited by humans. Mars was the obvious next target, and Hope approached the red planet with the same methodical thoroughness he'd applied to lunar subdivisions. If you thought mapping the moon into one-acre plots was ambitious, imagine trying to survey Mars, which is roughly the same size as Earth's land area. Hope didn't just claim Mars, he created detailed topographical maps, established Martian zip codes, and started selling plots based on proximity to interesting geological features like Olympus Mons and Valles Marineris. You could literally buy a vacation home next to the largest volcano in the solar system, which is either the ultimate fixer-upper opportunity or the worst possible location for property insurance. The marketing appeal was undeniable. Mars had always captured the human imagination in ways that the moon, for all its romantic associations, never quite managed. The moon was humanity's first cosmic stepping stone, but Mars was where we'd actually want to live. Hope's Martian property deeds came with disclaimers about the planet's current atmospheric conditions, thin air, freezing temperatures, radiation exposure, but also included optimistic projections about future terraforming projects that would make Mars suitable for human habitation. By now, the implication went, and you'll be perfectly positioned for humanity's expansion to the red planet. But Hope wasn't content to stop at Mars. Venus, despite being a hellish wasteland with surface, temperatures hot enough to melt lead, and an atmosphere composed primarily of sulfuric acid, was also subdivided and put up for sale. Hope's marketing materials diplomatically described Venus as a fixer-upper with tremendous potential, which might be the most optimistic real estate description in human history. The sales pitch focused on Venus's similarities to Earth in terms of size and mass, while carefully avoiding mention of the fact that its surface conditions would instantly kill any human visitor. The outer planets presented unique challenges for Hope's expanding real estate empire. Jupiter and Saturn, being gas giants, don't actually have solid surfaces to subdivide, but Hope solved this problem by selling atmospheric claims at various altitudes within the planetary atmospheres. You could own a cubic mile of Jupiter's Great Red Spot, or stake a claim to a section of Saturn's rings. It was creative property development taken to its logical extreme, where even empty space could be packaged and sold to enthusiastic customers. The moons of the outer planets offered more traditional real estate opportunities. Europa, with its subsurface ocean and potential for extraterrestrial life, commanded premium prices among Hope's more scientifically minded customers. Titan, with its thick atmosphere and methane lakes, was marketed as the perfect location for alternative energy development. Even tiny distant Pluto, still considered a planet in the 1990s, was surveyed and subdivided, though Hope admitted that property development there would probably require some pretty advanced heating systems. Hope's approach to interplanetary real estate development showed a surprising attention to astronomical accuracy. His property maps were based on actual NASA data and satellite imagery, meaning that if you bought a plot on Mars, you could theoretically identify its exact location using real topographical maps. The coordinates were accurate, the geological descriptions were legitimate, and the legal paperwork was as official looking as anything you'd find in a terrestrial real estate office. The only problem was that none of it was actually legally enforceable, but Hope's customers seemed willing to overlook that minor detail. The expansion to multiple planets also allowed Hope to offer package deals that would make any real estate developer proud. You could buy matching plots on Earth's moon and Mars for your earthbound home and your future retirement property. Families could purchase entire solar system estates with properties on multiple worlds to accommodate different family members' preferences. Romantic couples could buy his and hers asteroids because apparently nothing says eternal love quite like joint ownership of space rocks. The business logistics of managing a solar system-wide real estate empire were genuinely impressive. Hope's Nevada office had expanded again, with separate departments handling different planetary property sales. His staff became experts in the geological features, atmospheric conditions, and potential development challenges of worlds they'd never visit. They could discuss the relative merits of Martian polar properties versus equatorial locations, with the same expertise a traditional realtor might use to compare suburban neighborhoods. Hope even started offering specialized properties for different types of customers. Scientists could buy plots near interesting geological formations for future research stations. Mining companies could purchase asteroid claims with detailed mineral content projections. Environmental groups could buy large tracts of pristine, planetary wilderness to preserve for future generations. It was like having a cosmic real estate agent who could find the perfect property for any imaginable lifestyle or business need. The international response to Hope's solar system expansion was a mixture of fascination and bureaucratic paralysis. The same legal ambiguities that had allowed his lunar land sales to flourish applied equally to the rest of the solar system. No government wanted to legitimize his claims, but no one was prepared to definitively shut them down either. Hope had found a legal loophole large enough to drive a spacecraft through, and he was making the most of it. Space scientists found themselves in increasingly awkward positions when asked about Hope's planetary property sales. They couldn't endorse his claims without undermining decades of international space law. But they also couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that private property rights might eventually become relevant to space exploration. Some started hedging their bets, suggesting that while current claims were questionable, the general principle of private space property might need to be addressed as commercial space development advanced. By the late 1990s, Hope had sold property on every planet in the solar system, plus hundreds of moons, asteroids, and other celestial bodies. His customer base had grown to include people from over 180 countries, all united by their willingness to invest in humanity's cosmic future, one impossible real estate transaction at a time. He'd gone from owning the moon to owning most of the known universe, at least according to his filing cabinets full of official-looking deeds and property surveys. The most remarkable thing about Hope's solar system-wide expansion wasn't the audacity of claiming to own entire planets. It was how normal it had all become. His staff discussed Martian property development with the same casual professionalism they'd use for earthbound real estate. Customers called to ask about Jupiter's weather patterns and Venus's zoning restrictions, as if these were perfectly reasonable questions for a real estate office. Hope had created a parallel universe where interplanetary property ownership was not only possible but routine, and somehow he'd convinced thousands of people to live in that universe with him. Of course, once you've proven that selling impossible real estate can be incredibly lucrative, it's only a matter of time before other entrepreneurs decide they want a piece of the action. By the late 1990s, Dennis Hope was no longer the only person in the extraterrestrial property business. A whole cottage industry of cosmic real estate developers had emerged, each with their own unique approach to the challenge of selling land that nobody could actually visit, much less legally own. The first major competitor was a German businessman named Martin Jürgens, who took one look at Hope's success and decided that the moon was big enough for two landlords. Jürgens established what he called the Lunar Registry, positioning himself as the European alternative to Hope's American-based Lunar Embassy. His marketing strategy was brilliantly straightforward. Why buy lunar property from some guy in Siberia when you could buy it from someone who actually understood European consumer protection laws? It was the same product, essentially, but with better customer service and multilingual support. What made Jürgens particularly dangerous as a competitor was his attention to the legal details that Hope had somewhat glossed over. While Hope relied on the ambiguity of international space law, Jürgens actually hired lawyers to craft arguments for why his lunar property claims were more legitimate than his American competitors. He pointed out that Hope's original claim to the entire moon might actually be invalid due to its excessive scope, creating an opening for more reasonable, limited claims to specific lunar regions. The resulting legal battle between Hope and Jürgens was exactly as absurd as you'd expect from two people fighting over who had the right to sell property on the moon. Both sides hired attorneys, filed trademark disputes, and engaged in the kind of corporate warfare typically reserved for Fortune 500 companies. The spectacle of grown men in expensive suits arguing about lunar property rights in actual courtrooms was either a triumph of entrepreneurial spirit or evidence that capitalism had finally jumped the shark entirely. But the real innovation in extraterrestrial real estate came from a British entrepreneur named Francis Williams, who realized that everyone was thinking too small. Instead of just selling property on existing celestial bodies, Williams started selling entire asteroids. His asteroid mining corporation offered customers the chance to own entire space rocks, complete with mineral rights and exclusive mining privileges. The business model was brilliant. Asteroids were numerous enough to provide virtually unlimited inventory, small enough to be individually owned, and potentially valuable enough to justify the investment if space mining ever became feasible. Williams's marketing materials read like a cross between a real estate prospectus and a mining company annual report. He'd provide detailed analyses of each asteroid's estimated mineral content, orbital characteristics, and potential mining yield. Customers weren't just buying space rocks. They were investing in humanity's industrial future among the stars. It was Hope's business model elevated to the next level, where the product being sold actually had potential real-world value, assuming someone eventually figured out how to build asteroid mining equipment. The Japanese market produced perhaps the most culturally specific approach to space real estate with the Lunar Shrine Corporation, which sold plots specifically intended for spiritual and religious purposes. Customers could purchase lunar property for the construction of future temples, meditation centers, and sacred spaces. The company's marketing emphasized the moon's historical significance in Japanese culture and religion, positioning lunar property ownership as a way to honor ancestral traditions while participating in humanity's cosmic expansion. Then there was the Mars Colonial Development Corporation, run by a former NASA engineer who'd become frustrated with the agency's slow pace of space exploration. His approach was the most technically sophisticated, offering customers not just Martian property, but detailed development plans for future colonies. He'd calculated optimal locations for landing sites, identified potential sources of water and minerals, and created realistic timelines for terraforming projects. His customers weren't just buying land, they were investing in carefully planned colonial infrastructure. The competition forced Hope to up his game significantly. He started offering more sophisticated services, including geological surveys of lunar properties, detailed environmental assessments, and even architectural plans for future lunar construction. His staff began including former aerospace engineers and planetary scientists who could provide technical expertise to customers interested in the practical aspects of their space property investments. Some competitors tried to differentiate themselves through pricing strategies. The Budget Space Estates company offered lunar property for under $10 per acre, positioning themselves as the Walmart of extraterrestrial real estate. Others went in the opposite direction, selling premium properties at prices that would make Manhattan real estate agents jealous, complete with concierge services and exclusive customer events. The most creative competitor might have been the Stellar Naming Registry, which pivoted from the traditional star naming business to selling planets orbiting distant stars. Their argument was that if you're going to buy property you can't visit, why limit yourself to our solar system? For a few $100s, customers could own entire worlds orbiting stars hundreds of light years away. It was Hope's business, model taken to its logical extreme, where the product being sold was so distant that it might not even exist by the time the light from its star reached Earth. Hope's response to all this competition was characteristically audacious. He started franchising his business model. The Lunar Embassy began licensing international representatives who could sell lunar property in their local markets, while maintaining the legitimacy and recognition that came with Hope's original brand. It was like McDonald's, but for impossible real estate, with the same emphasis on consistent branding and standardized customer experience. The competition also led to some truly bizarre legal disputes. Multiple companies would claim exclusive rights to the same celestial bodies, leading to court cases where judges had to seriously consider questions like whether Mars could be subdivided by competing real estate developers. Some cases were settled out of court, presumably because both parties realized how ridiculous it would look to have their property dispute decided by a terrestrial judge who'd never set foot on the planet in question. Consumer protection agencies in various countries started receiving complaints from customers who'd bought space property from one company, only to discover that another company was also selling the same land. The resulting investigations led to official government statements about the legal status of extraterrestrial real estate, most of which boiled down to, "We have no idea what's going on, but buyer beware." By the turn of the millennium, the extraterrestrial real estate industry had become a legitimate business sector, complete with trade associations, industry publications, and professional conferences where competitors would gather to discuss market trends and regulatory challenges. Space historians still debate whether this represented the democratization of space exploration or the complete commercialization of human wonder, but either way, it was definitely entertaining to watch. The most successful competitors were those who understood that they weren't really selling real estate. They were selling stories, dreams, and participation in humanity's cosmic future. The companies that focused too heavily on the legal technicalities or tried to make their products too realistic usually failed, while those that embraced the fundamental absurdity of the enterprise while maintaining professional presentation standards thrived. Hope had accidentally created a new form of entertainment industry, where the product was the experience of believing, however briefly, that you could own a piece of the universe. And while you're lying there contemplating the vastness of space above your ceiling, let me tell you about one of the most deliciously awkward situations NASA has ever found itself in. You see, right now, as you're getting comfortable under your blanket, there are people making millions of dollars selling plots of land on the moon, and NASA, well, they're doing absolutely nothing about it, creating what might be the most expensive game of cosmic hot potato in human history. You drift deeper into this story, and you can almost picture the scene at NASA headquarters. Imagine walking into a meeting room where engineers who've sent humans to the moon are sitting around a conference table, staring at printouts of websites selling lunar real estate for $19.99 an acre. The silence is so thick you could cut it with a tang-flavored knife. Someone clears their throat. Someone else shuffles papers. Nobody wants to be the first to address the elephant in the room, or should I say the moon elephant in the room. The key. Whole mess began innocently enough, the way most bureaucratic nightmares do. Back in 1980, a Nevada entrepreneur named Dennis Hope decided to read the 1967 Outer Space Treaty very, very carefully. You know how when you're reading terms and conditions at 2 a.m., your brain starts finding loopholes that probably aren't really there? Well, Hope found what he considered the ultimate loophole. The treaty states that no nation can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, but it says absolutely nothing about individuals. So Hope did what any red-blooded American capitalist would do. He claimed ownership of the Moon, Mars, Venus, and most of the solar system, then started selling plots. You settle deeper into your pillow, and you can almost feel the cosmic irony washing over you. Here's NASA, the agency that literally put boots on lunar soil, watching from the sidelines as someone sells the very ground their astronauts walked on. It's like watching someone sell tickets to your own backyard barbecue while you stand there holding a spatula, legally powerless to stop them. The agency that can calculate trajectories to Mars down to the centimeter somehow can't figure out how to handle a guy with a website and a fax machine. But here's where it gets deliciously complicated, and you'll love this detail that most people never hear about. NASA's silence isn't just bureaucratic paralysis, it's actually a carefully calculated diplomatic strategy. You see, if NASA came out swinging against lunar land sales, they'd essentially be taking a legal position on space, property rights. And once you take a position, you have to defend it in court, which could set precedents that might completely mess up future space colonization efforts. It's like being asked if you believe in aliens at a dinner party. Sometimes the safest answer is to just smile mysteriously and change the subject. The truly bizarre part, and this will make you chuckle as you're drifting off, is that Hope's lunar embassy has sold over 600 million acres of moon real estate to more than 6 million customers worldwide. That's roughly 2.4 million square miles, bigger than Alaska and Texas combined. Celebrities have bought lunar plots. Politicians have received them as gifts. There are people out there with framed certificates claiming they own a piece of the Sea of Tranquility, hanging right next to their college diplomas. The moon apparently has become the ultimate conversation starter at cocktail parties. You can picture the water cooler conversations at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Engineers who've dedicated their lives to lunar exploration casually mentioning that their neighbor just bought 3 acres near the Apollo 11 landing site for less than the cost of a pizza. The cognitive dissonance must be overwhelming. It's like being a master chef and watching someone sell hamburgers made from your signature recipe, except the hamburgers are on the moon, and you're not entirely sure if they're legal or not. Historians still debate whether NASA's hands-off approach is brilliant strategic patience or bureaucratic cowardice. Some argue that the agency is wisely avoiding a legal quagmire that could complicate future missions. Others suggest they're simply hoping the whole thing will go away if they ignore it long enough. You know, like that weird noise your car makes that you pretend you can't hear. The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere in between, floating in that gray area where space law meets Earth politics. But here's a detail that'll really tickle your brain as sleep approaches. NASA actually does have opinions about lunar property rights. They just express them through the most passive-aggressive method possible: complete and utter silence. It's like the ultimate government non-response response. When reporters ask about lunar land sales, NASA officials perfect the art of saying absolutely nothing while using a lot of words. They'll discuss the technical challenges of lunar colonization, the importance of international cooperation, and the beautiful poetry of space exploration, all while carefully avoiding any mention of whether you can actually buy a crater for the price of a fancy dinner. The international implications are equally absurd, and you'll find this amusing. Other space agencies around the world look to NASA for guidance on these matters, and NASA's response is essentially a cosmic shrug. The European Space Agency asks questions. The Japanese space program raises eyebrows. The Russians probably just laugh, because let's be honest, they've always found American capitalism entertainingly ridiculous. Meanwhile, NASA continues its policy of strategic silence, like a parent pretending not to notice their kids having a food fight at the dinner table. You're getting drowsier now, but consider this final delicious irony. While NASA remains silent about lunar land sales, they're simultaneously spending billions of dollars planning to return humans to the moon through the Artemis program. So we have an agency that won't comment on lunar property rights actively working to put astronauts back on land that's supposedly been sold to millions of Earthbound customers. It's like planning a vacation to a hotel that may or may not exist, booked through a travel agent who may or may not have the right to sell rooms. The most entertaining part might be imagining future conversations between NASA astronauts and lunar landowners. Picture Commander Sarah reporting back to Houston. We've landed successfully in the Sea of Serenity, and there appears to be a no trespassing sign here with someone named Bob from Ohio listed as the owner. Ground Control's response would probably be another masterful display of saying nothing while sounding very professional about it. As you drift towards sleep, remember that somewhere out there, NASA officials are probably lying awake too, staring at their own ceilings, wondering how they ended up in a situation where they have to diplomatically ignore the fact that their greatest achievement, landing on the moon, has been turned into the world's most expensive real estate scam. And tomorrow they'll wake up, go to work, and continue the most awkward game of cosmic pretend ever played. Because sometimes the best way to handle an impossible situation is to act like it doesn't exist at all. And while the world was still chuckling over Dennis Hope's audacious lunar land grab, you're about to witness how one man's celestial real estate empire transformed into the most absurd diplomatic crisis since someone decided pineapple belonged on pizza. Picture this, it's the late 1990s, and Hope isn't content with just selling moon plots from his Nevada trailer. Oh no, he's got bigger dreams now, dreams that would make even the most seasoned diplomats question their career choices. You watch as Hope, sitting in his modest office surrounded by lunar maps and certificates, suddenly gets what he considers his most brilliant idea yet. If he's the rightful owner of the moon, then surely he needs proper representation on Earth, right? So he does. What any reasonable extraterrestrial property mogul would do, he starts appointing lunar ambassadors to various countries. You can almost hear the collective sigh from foreign ministries worldwide as Hope begins issuing official-looking diplomatic credentials to anyone willing to pay a fee and promise to represent lunar interests in their respective nations. The beauty of Hope's ambassador program lies in its spectacular absurdity. You see him carefully crafting ornate certificates, complete with gold seals and flowery language about representing the interests of lunar citizens and facilitating diplomatic relations between Earth and Moon. It's like watching someone play the world's most elaborate game of make-believe, except Hope is deadly serious, and surprisingly so are some of his customers. What historians still debate is whether Hope genuinely believed these ambassadorships carried any legal weight, or if he was simply a master of monetizing human gullibility. You witness the first real diplomatic friction when Hope's newly appointed lunar ambassador to Germany decides to actually approach the German Foreign Office about establishing formal recognition of lunar sovereignty. The bemused German officials, probably wondering if this is an elaborate prank, politely but firmly explain that they don't negotiate with celestial property developers. The ambassador, however, isn't deterred and begins sending regular correspondence about lunar mining rights and proposed embassy locations in Berlin. You can practically feel the bureaucratic eye rolls echoing through the halls of the Auswärtiges Amt. The situation escalates deliciously when Hope appoints multiple ambassadors to the same country, apparently forgetting that exclusive territorial representation is kind of the whole point of diplomacy. You watch as two different lunar ambassadors to France simultaneously approach the Quai d'Orsay, each claiming to be the sole legitimate representative of lunar interests. The French diplomats, masters of maintaining composure in absurd situations, reportedly responded with the kind of polite bewilderment typically reserved for particularly eccentric dinner party guests. Historians still puzzle over whether Hope's organizational chaos was intentional misdirection or simply the natural result of running a fake embassy network from a trailer park. But here's where things get genuinely interesting. You observe how some countries actually began taking Hope's activities seriously. Not because they believed in his lunar claims, but because his ambassadors were starting to create minor administrative headaches. The lunar ambassador to Russia somehow managed to register as a foreign representative with local authorities, leading to a brief but entertaining bureaucratic tangle when Moscow realized they'd accidentally legitimized someone claiming to represent the moon. You can imagine the vodka-fueled late-night meetings trying to figure out how to politely unrecognize lunar diplomatic status without admitting they'd been outsmarted by a Nevada entrepreneur. The comedy reaches peak absurdity when Hope decides his ambassadors need actual embassy buildings. You watch as several of his appointed representatives begin scouting real estate in capital cities, inquiring about purchasing or leasing properties for lunar diplomatic missions. The real estate agents, probably thinking this is either an elaborate money laundering scheme or the world's most expensive practical joke, nervously show them around while trying to figure out if lunar embassy is a euphemism for something more terrestrial. What's still debated among legal scholars is whether any of these embassy negotiations actually constituted attempts at establishing foreign diplomatic missions on sovereign soil. The situation takes an unexpectedly serious turn when several countries begin investigating Hope's operations for potential fraud. You see nervous ambassadors suddenly realizing that their lunar credentials might not protect them from earthly legal consequences. The lunar ambassador to Canada reportedly received a very polite but firm letter from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, suggesting that claiming diplomatic immunity based on moon ownership might not hold up in court. The ambassador quickly pivoted to describing his role as ceremonial, which is probably the most accurate description anyone had given of Hope's entire operation. You witness the international community's growing bewilderment as Hope's ambassador. Network expands to include representatives in over 30 countries. Each appointment comes with increasingly grandiose titles. Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the lunar territories becomes the baseline, with some recipients earning designations like Special Envoy for Interplanetary Commerce or Cultural Attaché for Earth-Moon Relations. It's like watching someone create a parallel diplomatic universe where the primary qualification for high office is a willingness to pay Dennis Hope a few $100s. Historians continue to debate whether this represents the democratization of diplomacy or simply the commodification of human delusion. The crisis deepens when Hope's ambassadors begin hosting actual diplomatic receptions. You observe these surreal gatherings where people in formal attire discuss lunar mining rights over cocktails, while genuinely confused local officials try to determine if they're witnessing legitimate diplomatic activity or an elaborate performance, art piece. The Lunar Embassy reception in London reportedly featured a detailed presentation on proposed spaceport locations, complete with PowerPoint slides and catering by a company that apparently specialized in cosmic cuisine. What legal experts still argue about is whether these events constituted unauthorized diplomatic activity or simply very expensive themed parties. But perhaps the most delicious irony emerges when you realize that Hope's fake diplomatic network is creating real diplomatic problems. Foreign ministries find themselves fielding inquiries from journalists asking about their lunar policy, while immigration officials struggle to determine if lunar ambassador is a legitimate reason for extended visa stays. The Spanish Foreign Ministry reportedly issued an internal memo clarifying that representing lunar interests was not grounds for diplomatic privileges, a sentence that probably never appeared in any previous government document in human history. The international incident reaches its crescendo when Hope announces the establishment of a Lunar United Nations, with his ambassadors serving as the founding members. You watch as this cosmic comedy of errors threatens to become an actual diplomatic crisis, with several countries privately expressing concern that Hope's activities might somehow compromise their space program relationships with NASA and other legitimate space agencies. The fear, however irrational, was that associating with lunar land sales might undermine their credibility in actual space exploration partnerships. And as you drift towards sleep, consider this final delicious detail. Hope's ambassador program continues to this day, with new representatives still being appointed to countries around the world. Somewhere tonight, a freshly minted lunar ambassador to New Zealand is probably practicing their diplomatic introduction in the mirror, blissfully unaware that their celestial credentials are about as legitimate as a $3 bill printed on moon dust. The question that still keeps international law experts awake at night isn't whether Hope's ambassadors have any real authority. It's what happens when someone with actual diplomatic training decides to take him seriously. And just as Hope's diplomatic circus was reaching peak absurdity, You're about to discover the deliciously ironic truth that makes this entire lunar land grab possible. Every single expert on the planet Earth knows these deeds are completely worthless, yet people keep buying them anyway. It's like watching someone sell snow to Eskimos, except the Eskimos know it's fake snow. They know they're being scammed, and they're absolutely delighted about the whole arrangement. You find yourself in the offices of NASA's legal department in the early 2000s, where lawyers are literally pulling their hair out trying to explain to increasingly frustrated callers that no, their lunar deed does not give them mining rights, and no, NASA cannot help them evict trespassers from their moon property. Picture these poor attorneys, people who went to law school to work on cutting-edge space exploration, now spending their days explaining why you can't homestead on celestial bodies. One NASA lawyer reportedly kept a special file labeled Moon Nuts for the dozens of weekly inquiries about lunar property rights. What legal scholars still debate is whether the constant stream of lunar property questions represents a failure of public education or simply the triumph of hope over legal reality. The scientific community watches this unfold with the kind of bemused fascination typically reserved for studying particularly odd animal behaviors. You see Dr. Patricia Williams, a space law expert at the University of Nebraska, giving the same presentation for the 100th time, explaining how the 1967 Outer Space Treaty makes private ownership of celestial bodies about as legally viable as claiming ownership of the Atlantic Ocean. Her PowerPoint slides have titles like Why Your Moon Deed is Toilet Paper and International Law versus Wishful Thinking. Yet after every presentation, someone inevitably approaches her asking if there might be some loophole, some tiny legal crack through which their lunar investment might somehow become legitimate. You witness the beautiful absurdity when actual. Rocket scientists have to explain basic property law to grown adults. Dr. James Logan from the Space Policy Institute finds himself in the surreal position of using physics equations to demonstrate why transporting construction materials to the moon would cost approximately $10 million per pound, making the $20 lunar lots economically meaningless, even if they were legal. It's like watching someone use calculus to prove that unicorns don't exist. Technically accurate, but missing the point entirely. The irony that historians still chuckle about is that people who wouldn't buy a used car without checking the title will happily purchase interplanetary real estate based on a certificate printed on someone's home computer. But here's where the psychology gets genuinely fascinating. You observe how the complete impossibility of lunar ownership actually increases its appeal. Dr. Sarah Chen, a behavioral economist at Stanford, studies what she calls fantasy investment syndrome, where the obvious illegitimacy of a purchase becomes part of its charm. Her research reveals that lunar deed buyers fall into distinct categories. The genuinely deluded, about 15%, the ironically amused, 60%, and the secretly hopeful, 25%. The secretly hopeful are the most interesting. They know it's fake. They know it's impossible, but they can't quite shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, if space law changes in the future. What psychologists continue to debate is whether this represents optimism or a fundamental misunderstanding of how legal systems work. The legal establishment watches this phenomenon with the kind of professional horror typically reserved for malpractice cases. You see law professors using lunar deeds as teaching tools, perfect examples of contracts that are both technically binding and completely worthless. Professor Michael Torres at Georgetown Law School keeps a collection of lunar certificates in his office, using them to illustrate the difference between legal validity and practical enforceability. His favorite exam question asks students to calculate the cost of filing a property dispute in lunar court, assuming standard Earth legal fees plus transportation costs to the moon. What jurisprudence experts still argue about is whether Hope's operation represents a brilliant exploitation of legal loopholes or simply high-level fraud with excellent marketing. You witness the moment when the European Space Agency decides to issue an official statement about lunar property sales, probably the most polite "stop being ridiculous" memo in diplomatic history. The statement, written in the kind of carefully neutral language that bureaucrats use when they want to call something stupid without actually saying so, explains that lunar property ownership violates multiple international treaties and approximately 400 years of established property law. The ESA lawyers who drafted this document reportedly spent weeks trying to find a professional way to say, "Seriously, people, come on." The document became required reading in space law courses worldwide, not for its legal insights, but as a masterclass in diplomatic frustration. The situation reaches peak scientific absurdity when actual astronauts start getting asked about lunar property rights. You can imagine the expression on Neil Armstrong's face when someone asked him if he'd seen any "no trespassing" signs during his moonwalk, or Buzz Aldrin's reaction to inquiries about whether he'd noticed any surveyor's stakes marking property boundaries. These men who risk their lives advancing human knowledge suddenly find themselves fielding questions about interplanetary real estate law. What's still debated among space historians is whether astronauts' bemused responses to property questions helped legitimize or delegitimize lunar land sales. But perhaps the most delicious scientific irony emerges when you realize that lunar geology actually makes Hope's property divisions completely meaningless. Dr. Maria Santos, a planetary geologist, explains how the moon's surface features change constantly due to meteor impacts, solar radiation, and seismic activity. Those carefully surveyed acres on Hope's maps would shift, disappear, or become unrecognizable within decades, even if anyone could actually visit them. It's like selling specific snowflakes during a blizzard, technically possible to identify, practically impossible to maintain. The scientific community's consensus is that lunar property ownership makes about as much sense as buying timeshares on comets. You observe the beautiful moment when computer scientists get dragged into this cosmic farce. Tech experts have to explain why GPS coordinates don't work on the moon, why Google Maps can't provide directions to lunar properties, and why blockchain technology can't somehow make fake deeds more legitimate. A software engineer at Microsoft reportedly spent an entire afternoon explaining to a lunar property owner why they couldn't get satellite internet service at their moon address. The intersection of cutting-edge technology and ancient property law creates conversations that sound like science fiction, written by someone who failed both physics and law school. The international scientific community watches this unfold with the kind of professional curiosity usually reserved for studying cargo cults. Anthropologists begin documenting lunar property sales as a modern form of magical thinking, while economists analyze the market dynamics of selling nothing to willing buyers. Dr. Robert Kim at MIT publishes a paper titled "The Economics of Impossible Goods," using lunar deeds as a case study in how markets can exist for products that cannot physically exist. What researchers still puzzle over is whether this represents evolution in human commerce or simply the monetization of collective delusion. And yet, despite mountains of scientific evidence, legal precedent, and expert testimony explaining why, lunar deeds are worthless. You watch as sales continue to climb. Hope's operation processes thousands of orders monthly, each one representing someone who either doesn't understand or doesn't care about the impossibility of their purchase. The customers range from genuine believers to gag gift buyers to people hedging their bets against future changes in space law. It's like watching a perpetual motion machine, powered by human optimism and willful ignorance. As you drift towards sleep, consider this final scientific paradox. The lunar deed phenomenon proves that humans are capable of creating thriving markets for products that violate the fundamental laws of physics, property, and common sense. Somewhere tonight, an aerospace engineer is probably lying awake wondering how we can put rovers on Mars, but can't convince people that you can't buy property there. The question that still keeps scientists up at night isn't how to explain why. Lunar ownership is impossible. It's why perfectly rational people continue buying anyway. And just when the scientific community thought they had successfully relegated lunar property sales to the realm of harmless delusion, you're about to witness how Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos accidentally turned Dennis Hope's cosmic joke into a potentially serious legal nightmare. Picture this. It's 2018, and while Hope is still selling moon plots from his Nevada office, actual billionaires with actual rockets are making actual plans to put actual people on the actual moon. Suddenly, those worthless lunar deeds don't seem quite so harmless anymore. You find yourself watching Elon Musk announce SpaceX's lunar tourism plans with the same casual confidence he uses to discuss weekend trips to the grocery store. As he stands there describing moon bases and lunar mining operations like their inevitable next Tuesday activities, you can practically hear the collective panic from space lawyers worldwide. These poor legal experts, who spent decades patiently explaining why lunar property ownership was impossible, suddenly realize they might need to figure out what happens when someone with a functional rocket ship shows up at Hope's imaginary real estate. What international law scholars still debate is whether Musk's lunar ambitions represent genuine space exploration or the world's most expensive way to test property law theory. The beautiful irony unfolds as you observe Jeff Bezos unveiling Blue Origin's moonlander, while Hope's customers suddenly start taking their lunar deeds very seriously. Imagine the conversations in corporate boardrooms as space company lawyers realize they might actually have to deal with people waving certificates claiming ownership of their proposed landing sites. The Lunar Gateway Foundation, Hope's latest corporate iteration, begins receiving inquiries from genuinely concerned property owners asking about mining rights and development permits. It's like watching a children's game of make-believe suddenly intersect with a construction project, except the construction site is 240,000 miles away, and the make-believe involves millions of dollars in rocket fuel. You witness the moment when NASA's Artemis program inadvertently validates Hope's business model by announcing specific lunar landing coordinates. Within days, Hope's office is flooded with calls from people checking whether their existing moon properties overlap with planned NASA activities. The space agency finds itself in the surreal position of having to issue statements clarifying that no, they don't need to check with private property owners before landing on the moon. And no, lunar deed holders can't file noise complaints about rocket engines. What space policy experts continue to puzzle over is how a government program designed to advance human knowledge somehow ended up legitimizing the world's most absurd real estate scam. The situation reaches peak comedy when you observe China announcing its own lunar base plans, triggering a minor panic among Hope's international customers who suddenly worry about foreign governments violating their property rights. The lunar embassy begins receiving frantic emails asking about diplomatic protections for moon property, while Hope hastily drafts official-looking letters to the Chinese space agency requesting they respect private ownership claims. The idea of Dennis Hope writing formal diplomatic correspondence to Beijing about lunar property disputes sounds like something from a satirical novel, yet here we are, living in that exact timeline. But here's where things get genuinely complicated. You watch as serious aerospace companies start quietly consulting with space lawyers about the legal implications of lunar property claims, not because they believe Hope's deeds are valid, but because they can't afford to ignore the possibility that some future court might take them seriously. SpaceX reportedly maintains a legal file tracking major lunar property sales, not for recognition purposes, but to anticipate potential litigation. It's like preparing for a lawsuit you know is ridiculous but can't quite dismiss as impossible. What corporate lawyers still lose sleep over is the nightmare scenario where successful lunar colonization somehow retroactively legitimizes decades of worthless property sales. You witness the delicious moment when private space companies realize they're accidentally creating a market for Hope's products. Every SpaceX launch announcement triggers a spike in lunar property sales as customers rush to buy land near proposed landing sites. Blue Origin's detailed moon base presentations become inadvertent marketing materials for Hope's operation, with buyers specifically requesting properties in areas mentioned by Jeff Bezos. The space tourism industry finds itself in the bizarre position of unintentionally advertising for a lunar real estate company they don't even acknowledge exists. Historians still chuckle about how legitimate space exploration became the best possible advertisement for completely illegitimate space commerce. The legal establishment watches this unfold with growing horror as they realize the theoretical Impossibility of lunar ownership might not matter if enough powerful people start taking it seriously. You observe law firms quietly establishing space property practice groups, not because they believe in lunar deeds, but because their clients are starting to ask uncomfortable questions. The conversation shifts from lunar ownership is impossible to lunar ownership is currently impossible, but might become relevant if... It's like watching the legal profession collectively hold its breath, waiting to see if science fiction becomes legal reality. You see the international space community grappling with an unprecedented situation. What happens when private companies with actual lunar capabilities encounter an established property owner claiming territorial rights? The European Space Agency issues carefully worded statements about respecting international space law while privately worrying about the public relations nightmare of having to explain why they're trespassing on someone's purchased moon property. The diplomatic language becomes increasingly creative as official statements try to dismiss lunar property claims without actually calling Hope's customers idiots. The situation escalates beautifully when SpaceX announces plans for a lunar starship. Landing and Hope's office receives hundreds of calls from property owners asking about potential damage to their investments. The Lunar Planning Department, apparently a real division within Hope's organization now, begins issuing environmental impact statements for proposed space missions, complete with official-looking letterhead and bureaucratic language about protecting lunar property values. You can imagine the expressions on SpaceX engineers' faces when they receive formal complaints about rocket exhaust potentially affecting nearby lunar lots. But perhaps the most delicate irony emerges when you realize that actual lunar colonization might require exactly the kind of property law framework that Hope has been pretending to provide. Space lawyers begin discussing legitimate lunar property rights systems, territorial claims for research stations, and mining concessions for private companies. The conversations sound remarkably similar to Hope's marketing materials, except they're happening in serious academic conferences rather than Nevada trailer parks. What legal theorists still debate is whether Hope accidentally created a template for future lunar governance or simply confused the issue beyond repair. You observe the beautiful absurdity as space tourism companies start including disclaimers in their contracts about lunar property rights. Virgin Galactic reportedly includes language stating that lunar flights don't constitute recognition of private property claims, while Blue Origin's passenger agreements specifically mention that tourists cannot establish territorial sovereignty by planting flags. These disclaimers exist solely because of Hope's operation, meaning that cutting-edge space tourism contracts contain provisions addressing a Nevada entrepreneur's cosmic real estate scam. The modern space race creates an unexpected feedback loop, where legitimate lunar activities make Hope's fake business seem more legitimate, which in turn creates more complications for actual space companies. You watch as this circular absurdity reaches its peak when SpaceX's Starship development progress directly correlates with spikes in lunar property sales. Every successful test flight becomes free advertising for Hope's operation as customers become increasingly convinced that their moon investments might actually become accessible. It's like watching a perpetual motion machine powered by technological progress and human gullibility. And as you drift towards sleep, consider this final cosmic irony. Dennis Hope's obviously fraudulent lunar real estate empire might accidentally become the foundation for actual property law on the moon. Somewhere tonight, space lawyers are probably lying awake wondering if the man who started selling moon plots as a joke in 1980 might end up being recognized as the first lunar property developer in history. The question that keeps the aerospace industry up at night isn't whether we'll colonize the moon, it's whether we'll have to buy the land from Dennis Hope first. And while the world's most brilliant minds were debating the legal implications of his cosmic real estate venture, you're about to discover how Dennis Hope quietly transformed his trailer park office into one of the most successful businesses based on selling absolutely nothing. Picture this. By the early 2000s, Hope wasn't just some guy with a crazy idea anymore. He was running a multi-million-dollar empire from the same Nevada location where it all started, except now his corporate headquarters had expanded to include multiple trailers, a small warehouse, and what he generously called his International Space Law Library. You find yourself watching Hope conduct business meetings in his air-conditioned double-wide, surrounded by lunar maps, framed certificates, and filing cabinets containing property records for customers who own land they'll never see on a world they'll never visit. The beautiful absurdity hits you when you realize this modest setup processes more interplanetary real estate transactions than every other company in human history combined. Hope sits behind his desk, the same folding table from 1980, now upgraded with a legitimate office chair, fielding calls from customers in Japan, Germany, and Australia who want to discuss their lunar investment portfolios. What business historians still marvel at is how Hope created a global corporation without ever producing a single tangible product. The empire's growth becomes evident as you observe Hope's staff expansion from a one-man operation to what he proudly calls the Lunar Embassy Corporation. By 2005, he employs 12 people in various capacities: deed processors, customer service representatives, a lunar cartography specialist who creates those official-looking property maps, and his crown jewel, a director of interplanetary relations, whose primary job involves answering emails from confused foreign governments. You can imagine the career counseling session where someone decided their life path involved professionally managing fake moon property customer service complaints. You witness Hope's business acumen as he diversifies beyond simple land sales into what can only be described as a complete lunar lifestyle brand. The gift shop, housed in a separate trailer, offers lunar soil samples, actually Nevada sand with a certificate of authenticity, moon rock jewelry, genuine earth rocks with cosmic marketing, and his best-selling item, Lunar Embassy coffee. Mugs that have somehow sold over 100,000 units worldwide. The irony that historians still chuckle about is that Hope makes more money selling coffee cups than some legitimate businesses make selling actual coffee. The corporate structure becomes deliciously complex as you discover Hope's web of subsidiary companies. The Lunar Development Authority handles large commercial transactions, the Galactic Government manages his ambassador program, and the Interplanetary Bank processes payments in what Hope calls lunar currency, special checks that look official but are basically elaborate receipts. Each division operates from its own corner of Hope's expanded trailer compound, creating the illusion of a bustling space commerce hub in the middle of the Nevada desert. What business analysts still puzzle over is how Hope created the appearance of legitimate corporate infrastructure around a business model based entirely on legal impossibility. You observe Hope's marketing genius as he leverages every space-related news event into a sales opportunity. When Mars rovers land successfully, Hope sends press releases about expanded planetary property offerings. When the International Space Station makes headlines, he promotes orbital real estate with spectacular Earth views. The 2012 Mayan calendar, apocalypse predictions triggered Hope's most successful marketing campaign ever. Secure your family's future on the moon, because you never know. The campaign generated over $2 million in sales from people genuinely worried about needing backup housing on celestial bodies. The psychology behind this success still fascinates marketing professors who use Hope's campaigns as case studies in selling impossible products to rational people. The business empire's sophistication becomes apparent when you discover Hope's customer relationship management system. He maintains detailed files on over 600,000 lunar property owners worldwide, tracking their purchase history, preferred property types, and even birthday reminders for sending promotional materials. The database includes notes like prefers crater-adjacent lots and interested in mineral rights upgrades. Hope's customer service team can instantly access any property owner's complete lunar portfolio, providing the kind of personalized attention typically reserved for actual real estate transactions. What customer service experts still study is how Hope created genuine customer loyalty for products that exist only on paper. You witness Hope's expansion into lunar tourism planning decades before it became technologically feasible. The Lunar Embassy Travel Agency, operating from yet another trailer, offers detailed vacation packages to moon properties, complete with proposed itineraries, packing lists, and estimated travel costs. The brochures feature Hope's own artist renderings of lunar hotels, recreational facilities, and even golf courses. Customers can book future reservations for moon vacations, paying deposits for trips that would cost approximately $10 billion per person if they were actually possible. The travel agency has collected over $500,000 in vacation deposits for trips that will never happen, making it possibly the most successful travel company specializing in impossible destinations. The Empire's legitimacy facade reaches peak absurdity when you discover Hope's Lunar Embassy University, an online institution offering degrees in interplanetary business administration and cosmic real estate law. The curriculum developed by Hope and his staff includes courses like Introduction to Off-World Property Management and Advanced Lunar Geology for Real Estate Professionals. Over 2,000 students have enrolled in various programs, paying tuition to study subjects that don't exist in preparation for careers that are impossible. What education researchers still debate is whether this represents the ultimate extension of for-profit education or simply the monetization of human curiosity about space. You observe Hope's personal transformation from trailer park dreamer to what he genuinely considers a legitimate business executive. He wears suits to work now, carries business cards identifying him as President and CEO of the Lunar Embassy Corporation, and maintains a schedule of board meetings held in his kitchen with his small staff. Hope has convinced himself so thoroughly of his enterprise's legitimacy that he files detailed tax returns, maintains corporate insurance policies, and even contributes to local Nevada business associations. The man who started selling Moonland as a desperate scheme now genuinely believes he runs a respectable international corporation. The financial success becomes undeniable when you realize Hope's operation generates approximately $11 million annually in revenue, with profit margins that would make legitimate businesses weep with envy. Since land costs nothing to produce and shipping involves mailing certificates, Hope's overhead consists mainly of printing costs, postage, and his staff's salaries. The business model is so efficient that Hope reportedly achieves profit margins exceeding 95%, making his lunar real estate venture more profitable than most Fortune 500 companies. What economists still study is how Hope created such extraordinary financial success from such obvious impossibility. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hope's empire emerges when you discover his genuine customer satisfaction ratings. Despite selling property that doesn't legally exist to customers who can never visit it, Hope maintains better customer service reviews than most legitimate businesses. His operation processes refund requests, rare, handles property transfers between family members, and even provides estate planning services for lunar inheritances. The customer testimonials read like reviews for actual real estate transactions, with buyers praising Hope's professionalism, attention to detail, and excellent lunar property selection assistance. You witness Hope's legacy planning as he begins, discussing succession arrangements for his interplanetary empire. His children, now adults, have grown up in the lunar real estate business and understand its operations better than most people understand their own jobs. Hope talks seriously about maintaining the family business for future generations, ensuring continued lunar property services for customers' children and grandchildren. The idea of a multi-generational dynasty built on selling impossible real estate has a certain cosmic poetry that business historians will probably analyze for decades. And as you drift towards sleep, consider this final testament to human entrepreneurship. Dennis Hope transformed a moment of personal desperation into a multi-million-dollar empire that has lasted over 4 decades, employed dozens of people, and brought genuine joy to hundreds of thousands of customers worldwide. Somewhere tonight, Hope is probably reviewing tomorrow's lunar property sales reports, planning new marketing campaigns, and dreaming of the day when his impossible business might somehow become possible. The question that keeps business schools fascinated isn't how Hope built an empire selling nothing. It's why nobody else thought to try it first. And while Hope was building his cosmic empire from Nevada trailers, you're about to discover the fascinating psychological battlefield that divides humanity into 2 camps. those who genuinely believe they own pieces of the moon, and those who think Dennis Hope should be in federal prison. The beautiful thing about lunar property sales isn't the business model itself. It's how it reveals the deepest truths about human nature, hope, and our eternal capacity for both wonder and self-deception. You find yourself sitting in Dr. Margaret Chen's psychology lab at UCLA, where she spent 5 years studying what she calls impossible purchase syndrome, using Hope's customer base as her primary research subjects. The interviews are absolutely fascinating. You watch as perfectly rational people, including doctors, lawyers, and engineers, explain with complete sincerity why they've invested thousands of dollars in lunar real estate. Mrs. Patricia Williams, a retired school teacher from Ohio, shows Dr. Chen her carefully organized lunar property portfolio while discussing her plans to pass the land down to her grandchildren. The cognitive dissonance is beautiful. She knows space travel is currently impossible, yet she's created a detailed family estate plan involving moon property. What psychologists still debate is whether this represents healthy optimism or elaborate self-delusion. The believer psychology becomes even more intriguing when you observe how lunar property owners create entire fantasy narratives around their purchases. You see Robert Martinez, a software engineer from Texas, who's built detailed spreadsheets tracking the theoretical value appreciation of his 17 lunar lots based on projected space tourism growth. He discusses crater proximity, mineral, rights potential, and Earthrise views with the same analytical precision he applies to his day job. The man has created sophisticated financial models for assets that exist only on paper, demonstrating how human imagination can construct elaborate, logical frameworks around impossible premises. Behavioral economists still study Martinez's case as a masterclass in rationalized wishful thinking. You witness the community aspect that makes lunar ownership psychologically addictive. Hope's customers have formed online forums, social media, groups, and even local meetup clubs where they discuss their lunar investments with the seriousness of actual real estate investors. The Lunar Property Owners Association holds annual conventions in Las Vegas, where hundreds of people gather to share property photos, discuss development plans, and network with fellow moon landowners. You can imagine the conversations. My crater has excellent solar exposure, and I'm thinking of subdividing my Mare Tranquillitatis parcel. What sociologists find fascinating is how Hope's customers have created a genuine community around shared ownership of imaginary assets. But the skeptic camp provides equally compelling psychology, and you observe their reactions with growing amusement. Dr. James Peterson, a law professor at Harvard, has made debunking lunar property sales his personal crusade, giving lectures titled "The Greatest Legal Scam in History" and maintaining a website dedicated to explaining why Hope's operation constitutes fraud. The irony is delicious. Peterson spends more time thinking about lunar property law than most of Hope's actual customers. His detailed legal analysis of why moon ownership is impossible runs longer than some doctoral dissertations, suggesting that passionate skepticism can become just as obsessive as passionate belief. You discover the beautiful psychology behind gift purchases, which represent nearly 40% of Hope's sales. People who would never buy lunar property for themselves happily purchase moon lots as presents, creating a fascinating psychological loophole where the impossibility becomes part of the charm. Sarah Thompson bought lunar property for her astronomy-obsessed nephew's graduation gift, explaining that it's the thought that counts, and besides, maybe someday. The gift psychology reveals how lunar ownership functions as a socially acceptable way to express cosmic optimism without admitting personal investment in the impossible. What anthropologists still study is how Hope accidentally created the perfect gift for people who want to give something unique without spending serious money. The believer community develops increasingly sophisticated justifications that sound almost reasonable until you remember they're discussing owning land on the moon. You watch as Dr. Michael Roberts, a retired NASA engineer who owns 12 lunar lots, explains his investment strategy based on early adoption advantages in emerging markets. His analysis includes projected colonization timelines, estimated property appreciation rates and detailed comparisons to historical frontier real estate markets. The man applies genuine expertise to complete fantasy, creating arguments so logical they're almost convincing. Cognitive scientists use Roberts's case to study how intelligent people can construct elaborate rational frameworks around irrational premises. The skeptic's psychology reveals equally fascinating patterns, particularly among legal professionals who seem personally offended by Hope's success. Attorney General offices in multiple states have investigated Hope's operation, not because customers complained, they rarely do, but because lawyers find the legal impossibility professionally insulting. You observe Assistant Attorney General Linda Martinez in California, spending weeks building a fraud case against Hope, only to discover that satisfied customers refuse to cooperate with prosecution efforts. The legal establishment's frustrated attempts to protect people who don't want protection create surreal situations where prosecutors argue that crime victims are too happy to recognize they've been victimized. You witness the generational divide in lunar property psychology, where older buyers tend toward genuine belief, while younger customers approach it as elaborate performance art. Millennial lunar property owners often describe their purchases as ironic investments or cryptocurrency for space nerds, suggesting they understand the impossibility while still finding emotional value in the transaction. 23-year-old Alex Chen bought lunar property as a hedge against late-stage capitalism and posts Instagram photos of her moon deed with captions like, "Diversifying my portfolio into impossible assets." What generational researchers find intriguing is how different age groups can purchase identical products for completely different psychological reasons. The believer psychology reaches peak complexity when you discover how lunar property ownership affects actual life decisions. Maria Santos, a teacher from Florida, chose her earthly home location partially based on its clear night sky views, allowing her to observe her lunar investments with binoculars. She spent thousands of dollars on telescope equipment to photograph her moon property, creating elaborate albums documenting seasonal lighting changes on her lots. The woman has developed genuine emotional attachment to lunar terrain she's never physically experienced, demonstrating how humans can form real relationships with imaginary possessions. Attachment theory researchers still puzzle over how people create meaningful bonds with assets that exist only conceptually. But perhaps the most fascinating psychological divide emerges between academic skeptics and customer satisfaction data. You observe the beautiful irony where PhD economists write papers explaining why lunar property sales represent market failure, while Hope maintains customer satisfaction ratings above 90%. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, a different doctor. Warren, who studies consumer psychology, discovered that lunar property buyers report higher satisfaction levels than customers of most legitimate businesses. The cognitive dissonance is extraordinary. People are more satisfied with property they can't visit than with products they use daily. What consumer psychology experts continue to debate is whether this represents the ultimate placebo effect or simply proves that happiness comes from belief rather than reality. The skeptic community develops its own obsessive behaviors, with debunkers spending enormous energy fighting a business model that largely regulates itself through obvious impossibility. You see Professor David Kim at MIT maintaining detailed databases, tracking Hope's sales figures, legal challenges, and customer testimonials, essentially creating a comprehensive academic study of something he considers completely worthless. The professors studying lunar property scams often know more about Hope's business than Hope himself, suggesting that passionate opposition can become its own form of engagement. The psychology of skepticism sometimes mirrors the psychology of belief, just with opposite emotional valence. You observe how the believer-skeptic divide creates parallel universes of discussion about the same phenomenon. Believers discuss lunar property at conferences with titles like Investing in Humanity's Future, while skeptics present papers at academic conferences titled Consumer Fraud in the Digital Age. Both groups generate comparable amounts of documentation, analysis, and passionate discourse about Dennis Hope's operation, yet they might as well be discussing completely different subjects. The two communities rarely interact directly, preferring to maintain their separate interpretive frameworks rather than risk having their worldviews challenged by contrary evidence. And as you drift towards sleep, consider this final psychological paradox. Dennis Hope has created a business that reveals more about human nature than most actual psychology experiments. His lunar property sales serve as a massive, decades-long study of belief, skepticism, hope, and the human capacity to find meaning in the impossible. Somewhere tonight, a lunar property owner is probably looking up at the moon with genuine pride of ownership, while a skeptical academic is probably writing another paper explaining why such feelings are completely irrational. The question that keeps psychologists awake isn't whether lunar property ownership makes sense. It's what the fact that it continues to thrive tells us about the beautiful complexity of human consciousness. And just as Hope was launching his cosmic real estate venture into the stratosphere of human gullibility, you're about to discover the single most ironic twist in this entire lunar saga. There actually was an international treaty specifically designed to prevent exactly what Dennis Hope was doing, except nobody who mattered bothered to sign it. Picture this delicious bureaucratic comedy. In 1979, 1 year before Hope filed his lunar land claim, the United Nations crafted the Agreement Governing the Activities of States on the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, a document so perfectly suited to stopping Hope's operation that it reads like it was written specifically with him in mind. You find yourself in the sterile conference rooms of the United Nations in Vienna, watching diplomats from around the world spend months carefully crafting language that would definitively establish the moon as the common heritage of mankind and explicitly prohibit private property ownership on celestial bodies. The treaty is legal perfection, every possible loophole closed, every potential ambiguity resolved, every conceivable scheme to commercialize lunar real estate thoroughly blocked. Article 11 states with crystal clarity that the moon and its natural resources are the common heritage of mankind, and that neither the surface nor the subsurface of the moon shall become the property of any state, international, intergovernmental or non-governmental organization, national organization or non-governmental entity, or of any natural person. It's like watching legal experts create the perfect anti-hope device, except they don't know hope exists yet. What international law scholars still marvel at is how the UN managed to write Dennis Hope's entire business model out of legal existence before he even thought of it. The beautiful irony unfolds as you observe which countries actually signed this lunar property prevention masterpiece. The list reads like a roster of nations you'd expect to find at an International Space Conference's kids' table. Uruguay, Chile, Kazakhstan, Lebanon, and a handful of others whose combined space budgets wouldn't fund a decent telescope. Meanwhile, the countries that actually launch rockets, the United States, Russia, China, India, Japan, looked at this treaty and essentially said, thanks, but no thanks. You can imagine the diplomatic conversations. Should we sign the thing that prevents private lunar ownership? Do we have any plans for private lunar ownership? Not really. Then why limit our options? What diplomatic historians still chuckle about is how the world's space powers refused to close a legal loophole they didn't think anyone was crazy enough to exploit. You witness the treaty's tragic timing as it opens for signature in December 1979, just months before Hope's desperate unemployment leads him to his cosmic real estate inspiration. If the major space powers had signed this agreement, Hope's entire 1980 legal filing would have been meaningless from the start. Instead, you watch as the treaty sits in international legal limbo, technically valid, but practically worthless, because the countries with actual space capabilities treat it like a suggestion rather than law. The Moon Treaty becomes the international equivalent of a no trespassing sign that nobody in authority bothers to acknowledge, creating the perfect legal vacuum for Hope's operation to flourish. The diplomatic comedy deepens when you discover why the major powers refused to sign. The United States delegation objected to the common heritage of mankind language, worried it might prevent American companies from eventually mining lunar resources. Soviet representatives raised similar concerns about restricting their future space activities. The irony is exquisite. Both superpowers were so focused on protecting their theoretical right to exploit the moon that they accidentally protected Dennis Hope's actual right to sell it. China, Japan, and India followed similar logic, each preferring to keep their lunar options open rather than commit to international oversight. What strategic planners still debate is whether these countries anticipated private space development or simply suffered from a collective failure of imagination. About lunar commerce, you observe the treaty supporters' growing frustration as they realize their perfect legal framework is being ignored by the very countries it was designed to regulate. Dr. Patricia Williams, a space law expert who helped draft the treaty language, spends the 1980s giving increasingly desperate presentations about the importance of lunar governance, unaware that her theoretical concerns are becoming Dennis Hope's actual business model. Her academic papers warning about the dangers of unregulated celestial commerce read like prophecies, except she's warning about multinational corporations rather than a man in a Nevada trailer park. The disconnect between high-level policy concerns and ground-level reality creates a situation where experts are preparing for sophisticated legal challenges while completely missing the obvious amateur one. The legal establishment's blindness to Hope's operation becomes even more absurd when you realize the Moon Treaty explicitly addresses his exact scheme. Article 4 prohibits any claim of sovereignty over lunar territory, while Article 11 specifically prevents ownership by any natural person, language so precise it could have been written with Hope's business cards in mind. Yet, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, space lawyers continue debating theoretical lunar property issues, while Hope processes thousands of actual lunar property sales. It's like watching fire safety experts discuss hypothetical arson prevention, while an actual arsonist burns down buildings across the street. What jurisprudence scholars still puzzle over is how the legal community could be so focused on preventing something that was already happening. You witness the moment when space law academics finally discover Hope's operation and realize their carefully crafted international framework has been completely circumvented by someone who simply ignored it. Professor Michael Chen at Georgetown Law School reportedly spent an entire sabbatical researching how Hope's business could exist despite the Moon Treaty, only to discover the embarrassingly simple answer. The treaty doesn't matter if the countries with enforcement power don't recognize it. His resulting paper, When International Law Meets Nevada Entrepreneurship, became required reading in space law courses, not for its legal insights, but as a cautionary tale about the gap between international agreements and practical reality. The diplomatic community's response to Hope's success reveals the fundamental weakness of international law when major powers choose non-participation. You observe UN officials quietly discussing whether to strengthen lunar property restrictions, only to realize that stronger language won't matter if the same countries refuse to sign. The Moon Treaty becomes a perfect example of international law's limitation. It can prohibit anything perfectly, but only for countries willing to be prohibited. Meanwhile, Hope operates from Nevada, where the Moon Treaty carries about as much legal weight as a suggestion to be nice to neighbors. But perhaps the most delicious irony emerges when you discover that several Moon Treaty signatory countries actually have citizens who've purchased Hope's lunar property. Uruguay, which proudly signed the agreement establishing the moon as common heritage of mankind, has dozens of nationals who own individual pieces of it through Hope's operation. The cognitive dissonance is beautiful. These customers live in countries that officially reject private lunar ownership while personally practicing it. What international relations experts still study is how citizens can simultaneously support government policies and engage in activities those policies prohibit. You observe the treaty's modern relevance as private space companies make lunar colonization increasingly realistic. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other aerospace firms operate under the legal framework created by the Moon Treaty's failure. They can pursue lunar activities without the international oversight the treaty would have established. The agreement that could have prevented Dennis Hope's cosmic comedy has become the legal foundation, allowing legitimate space companies to potentially vindicate his impossible claims. The circular irony is perfect. The treaty designed to prevent lunar commercialization failed, enabling both fake lunar commerce and potentially real lunar development. The international legal community watches this unfold with the kind of professional horror typically reserved for constitutional crises. You see space lawyers realizing that the Moon Treaty's failure to achieve widespread adoption has created a legal environment where lunar property rights exist in a bizarre twilight zone between obviously impossible and potentially legitimate. The treaty that should have settled lunar ownership questions definitively instead created more questions by failing to achieve the international consensus necessary for meaningful enforcement. And as you drift towards sleep, consider this final, diplomatic irony. The most comprehensive international agreement ever written about lunar property rights has been completely irrelevant to the world's most successful lunar property business. Dennis Hope built his empire in the legal space created by the Moon Treaty's failure, proving that sometimes the most important international agreements are the ones nobody signs. Somewhere tonight, diplomats are probably still debating whether to strengthen lunar property restrictions, while Hope processes orders from customers around the world who couldn't care less about international treaty obligations. The question that keeps international lawyers awake isn't whether the Moon Treaty should have been stronger. It's whether international law can ever keep pace with human creativity in finding loopholes. And so you find yourself standing at the intersection of cosmic law and human ambition, where Dennis Hope's seemingly absurd lunar land grab has rippled through decades of space policy, like a stone thrown into the vast ocean of legal precedent. You can almost hear the lawyers sharpening their briefcases as they contemplate the implications. Because yes, even in the vacuum of space where no one can hear you scream, they can apparently still hear you file paperwork. You witness the birth of what scholars now call space law, a field so niche it makes maritime law look mainstream. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, that document everyone thought would settle things once and for all, suddenly seems as full of holes as Swiss cheese floating in zero gravity. You watch as legal experts scratch their heads, realizing they'd created a treaty that said no nation could own celestial bodies, but forgot to mention what happens when your neighbor Bob decides he owns the moon, because he sent a strongly worded letter to the United Nations. It's like writing a law that says no parking, but forgetting to specify who can't park there. The ripple effects of Hope's lunar land office spread through the halls of academia and government like gossip at a space station coffee break. You observe as universities suddenly find themselves offering courses in extraterrestrial property law, a subject that would have sounded like science fiction just decades earlier. Students sit in lecture halls, earnestly debating whether adverse possession applies to planets, while their professors wonder if their law degrees prepared them to discuss mineral rights on asteroids. The absurdity is palpable, yet here we are, treating it with the same seriousness as any earthbound property dispute. You feel the ground shifting beneath international relations as countries begin to realize that maybe, just maybe, they should have been more specific about space ownership rules. The European Space Agency starts whispering about lunar bases, while China quietly launches missions that definitely aren't about claiming territory. Wink, wink. It's like watching a very slow, very expensive game of cosmic Monopoly, where everyone's pretending they're not trying to pass go and collect $200 worth of helium-3. Historians still debate whether Hope's audacious claim actually accelerated legitimate space nations' timelines, or if it was all just an elaborate coincidence wrapped in bureaucratic timing. The commercial space industry emerges like mushrooms after rain, with entrepreneurs suddenly realizing that if some guy from Nevada can claim the moon, maybe there's money to be made in the great beyond. You watch as venture capitalists, those earthbound creatures who normally wouldn't fund a lemonade stand without seeing 3 years of profit projections, suddenly start throwing money at anyone with a rocket and a dream. SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, they all dance around the question of space property rights while building the very infrastructure that might make those rights relevant. It's capitalism meets cosmic exploration with a healthy dose of, let's figure out the legal stuff later. You observe the peculiar phenomenon of lunar property becoming a novelty gift industry. Gift shops from Tokyo to Toledo start selling certificates for plots of moon real estate, complete with deed numbers that sound official enough to fool your mother-in-law. Wedding registries begin including his and hers lunar lots right next to the matching towel sets. The irony isn't lost on legal scholars. People are buying property that probably isn't legally theirs from a man who definitely doesn't legally own it, while governments pretend the whole thing isn't happening. It's like watching the world's most expensive game of make-believe. The scientific community finds itself caught in an unexpected crossfire between commerce and exploration. You witness researchers carefully avoiding any language that might suggest ownership, while simultaneously planning long-term lunar installations that look suspiciously permanent. NASA starts talking about sustainable lunar presence rather than lunar bases, because apparently word choice matters when lawyers are listening. The International Space Station becomes a diplomatic masterpiece, partly because it sidesteps the ownership question entirely. It's like having roommates who are very careful never to discuss whose name is on the lease. You feel the tension, building as private companies begin launching actual missions to the moon, not just selling imaginary real estate. When SpaceX or Blue Origin's rockets touch down on lunar soil, suddenly, Hope's certificates don't seem quite so ridiculous anymore. The question shifts from who can claim the moon to what happens when someone actually shows up with the ability to stay there. It's like the difference between claiming you own the North Pole from your living room and actually building an igloo there. Legal experts worldwide begin crafting new frameworks for space commerce, trying to thread the needle between encouraging innovation and preventing cosmic colonialism. You watch as treaties are proposed, amended, debated, and shelved with the efficiency of a bureaucracy that suddenly realized they need to regulate something they never thought would be relevant in their lifetime. The Artemis Accords emerge as America's attempt to create modern space law, while other nations respond with the diplomatic equivalent of, "That's just like your opinion, man." Scholars still debate whether these agreements will prevent space conflicts or just make them more politely worded. The philosophical implications ripple through human consciousness, like waves in a cosmic pond. You witness humanity grappling with questions that would have seemed purely theoretical just generations ago. If someone plants a flag on Mars, does that create a territorial claim? If you mine an asteroid, do you own it or just the materials you extract? If aliens show up and see our property deeds, will they laugh so hard that their flying saucers crash? These aren't just legal questions anymore. They're existential ones about humanity's place in the universe and our tendency to put invisible lines around everything we see. You observe the emergence of space archaeology, where scholars study the artifacts left by early space missions with the same reverence once reserved for ancient pottery shards. Every lunar landing site becomes a historical monument, protected not by any clear legal framework, but by a sort of cosmic gentleman's agreement that some things are too important to mess with. It's like watching humanity grow up in real time, realizing that our space junk might actually be future treasures worth preserving. The environmental movement extends its reach beyond Earth's atmosphere, with activists arguing that celestial bodies deserve protection from strip mining and industrial development. You witness the birth of astro-environmentalism, where people who've never left their home planet passionately argue about preserving the pristine nature of worlds they'll never visit. It's both touching and slightly absurd, like watching someone organize a neighborhood watch for a house that doesn't exist yet. As decades pass, you see Hope's legacy crystallize into something more profound than anyone expected. His lunar land office becomes a catalyst for serious discussions about space governance, property rights, and humanity's expansion beyond Earth. Universities now offer entire degree programs in space law. Governments have dedicated departments for extraterrestrial affairs, and the United Nations hosts committees that seriously debate questions that once belonged purely to science fiction. What started as one man's audacious gambit has become the foundation for humanity's legal framework among the stars. The question of cosmic ownership remains beautifully unresolved, hanging in the void like Schrödinger's property deed, simultaneously. Valid and invalid, until someone with enough lawyers shows up to collapse the wave function. You witness a world where lunar real estate certificates hang on office walls next to law degrees, where space mining companies file claims with governments that aren't entirely sure they have jurisdiction, and where the phrase extraterrestrial property law appears in serious academic journals without anyone giggling. And now, as the story of Hope's lunar lunacy draws to its close, you feel the weight of cosmic possibilities settling over you like stardust. The legal battles may continue to rage in courtrooms across Earth, but up there, beyond our atmosphere, the moon continues its ancient dance around our planet, completely indifferent to our human need to own and organize everything we see. The stars twinkle with the same light they've shared for billions of years, carrying no deeds, no boundaries, no invisible lines drawn by ambitious dreamers. Perhaps that's the most beautiful part of Hope's legacy, not the property claims, or the legal precedents, but the reminder that some things remain wonderfully, eternally free. The cosmos stretches endlessly above us, vast and patient and unclaimed by any earthly authority, and as you drift towards sleep, you can imagine yourself floating weightless among those distant stars, where ownership is just an earthbound concept that fades like morning mist. The moon watches over your dreams tonight, neither owned nor owning, simply being, as it has always been, as it will always be, carrying the wishes and wonder of everyone who has ever looked up and dared to dream of touching the sky. Sleep now, dreamer. The universe is vast and patient, and there's room enough for all our dreams among the stars.